University at Southeast Missouri State University, where I got my degree in biology, and he worked in the biology department, and he actually hired me to help tutor students that were taking science classes, and they would come to the Learning Center. And then we also interacted. I was president of the science club at college, and Alan was a teacher there, and maybe I'll let you give a few more details. Maybe you can tell them a little bit about your research or something. All right.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Andrea. If you don't mind my calling you Andrea,
go ahead.
Ms. Boff seems
We're
a
friends,
little
so.
too formal. Andrea and I met many, many years ago, more years than probably either of us would care to count.
And we won't say it out loud.
We played a lot of softball together, as I recall. Andrea was organizing the biology student softball team, and the faculty came out, and I think the faculty usually got trounced.
Of course.
As I recall.
Because you guys were old.
Well, thank you, even back then. Okay, so Andrea's asked me to talk a little about the climate summit and what that's all about, which I'm more than happy to do. I got involved in the whole arena of global warming and its climate change consequences because I was teaching ecology at Southeast Missouri State University, and I was beginning to realize how desperate the impact of global warming as projected would be on our natural systems and by extension our agriculture and our forestry. And I think there's developing a general sense amongst the scientific community that this is a real problem. One of the best ways to think about climate change is to think about what's happening in our own area. So I'm not living in San Diego myself. I did a little poking around to find out what kind of experiences you guys are having down there. I live in Southern Oregon, which is just at the other end of California, so it's just over the border. And we are experiencing, where I'm living, pretty much the same kind of drought pattern that you are experiencing. As you probably know, Central California is in very severe drought conditions. For you and for us, we're just on the edge of that, but we're still suffering from extreme drought. And we have been doing for some time. The other thing that you're experiencing and we're experiencing too is increasing temperatures. And Andrea has a website from the U.S. Geological Survey which you can look at. You can go to and you look at historic trends and for future projections. Assuming we follow what we're generally tending to do, what is called the business as usual model, meaning we keep pumping greenhouse gases into our atmosphere at the rate we've been doing. What we can see is the projections are pretty dire for our climate and for the natural systems, agriculture, forestry, that we depend on. And the general awareness and concern about this has resulted in the United Nations having this climate summit, which was called for September the 23rd, I think it was. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon asked world leaders to come together, and their goal was to bring with them some bold actions that they are planning to take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the whole idea of that one-day summit was to stimulate people, because coming up in Paris next year there's going to be another major United Nations gathering addressing climate change. But one of the problems that we have is, particularly in the United States, we have a Congress which is composed of a number of people, a sufficient number of people who are deniers of the science, particularly the science regarding climate change, such that in the United States not as much is happening as should be happening. We should be a leader when it comes to addressing climate change and developing solutions and how we can adapt to that which is inevitable. Unfortunately, we're not doing as well as we should. The president is trying to move things forward, but he's having to do it almost to a large extent by working around Congress. And that was the reason that we had this People's Climate March in New York. There's a recognition amongst those who are very concerned about climate change that one of the ways to stimulate politicians to take action is to essentially to stand up and be counted. Probably many of you don't recall, but during the civil rights movement back in the 60s, one of the most effective ways that people had to try and move things forward was to demonstrate it. So there were large gatherings of people in Washington, D.C. and various other places which stimulated the federal government to actually pass legislation which dealt with civil rights. And the same thing was true for the Vietnam War. That really didn't wind down, get ended until, again, people who were objecting to the Vietnam War stood up and were counted. We're in exactly the same situation now with climate change. We have a lot of folks, many of them are actually elected representatives, who simply deny science. And we really need to act on this. There's a problem. If we don't, the folks who are really going to be suffering most from global warming and the climate change consequences are folks in your generation and generations beyond. So for those of us who've lived a little longer, like me, a bit longer in the tooth, have a little less hair maybe, for us, this is an imperative, and it's an imperative in the arena of what I call intergenerational justice. If we live our lives following what has been the business as usual model, it's been a great ride. Fossil fuels have really been wonderful and provided us with a tremendous standard of living. But we have to recognize they've also been causing tremendous problems. We're now becoming very much more aware of what these problems are. And now it's time, if you like, to pay the piper for all the fine music that he's been giving us. So we really need to act on the cause of global warming, which is largely very well understood. 97% of climate scientists accept the conclusion that the planet is warming and the major contributor is our emissions of greenhouse gases. We really need to move forward on that if we are to protect our planet for you guys and for your kids and on down through the generations. So that's where we are. That's what the Climate Summit was all about. And that's why there were 400,000 people gathering in New York City to demonstrate about climate science and climate change.
All right.
I guess, shall I take any questions?
Yeah, how about a couple questions about the summit or about climate change or, yeah. All right, Benji. Here, why don't you take the microphone? Can someone take that back to him real quick or hand it to him? There you go. All right, I might, if you can't hear, I'll interpret. This is Benji. These are all sixth graders.
Hi,
Hi.
Benji. Okay, I can't see you, Benji, so you'll have to speak.
That's right. You don't need to see him. I'll just tell you what he says.
You know what?
You're not going to tell me what he looks like?
Pull it a little bit further away. Go ahead.
Do you know when climate change started?
When did climate change started? Sorry.
Yes, we are pretty well. We're pretty clear on this one. The problem started with the Industrial Revolution, which was about the 1750s, and that's when the steam engine was invented, and that was an invention which made mechanization very much more possible, and it involved burning coal to power equipment that people were using in their daily lives to manufacture. So that's when carbon dioxide, which is the primary greenhouse gas, that's when carbon dioxide started building up in the environment. And interestingly, as long ago as the 1800s, folks started understanding what the potential consequences of this were. Because we tend to think, I think, these days that climate change, global warming is something we just discovered or just invented, but actually people have been developing their understanding about what the atmosphere does and how it retains heat. Since 1824, I think it was John Tyndall was the first who came up with these ideas. No, excuse me, it was Joseph Fourier, but that doesn't really matter. John Tyndall came along a bit later and identified what it was in the atmosphere that was trapping the heat. So we go back 1750, that's over 250 years to when we can see the problem building starting. But the major problem in terms of increasing temperature and increasing carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, that really has happened since about the 1960s, when nations across the planet have been industrializing and increasing their industrial output and increasing their standard of living. And of course, everybody has a legitimate aspiration to enhance standard of living. So one of the things that we have to do in the United States, where we are technologically on the cutting edge, if you like, what we have to do is help other nations, developing nations, avoid that incredible coal, oil period that we've gone through. It's been very good to us, of course, but we have, if every person on the planet lived the kind of lifestyle that we enjoy here and burned the amount of fossil fuel that we burn here, we would be really up a creek without a paddle, to use a common phrase. We really have to control this. Sorry, I rambled on a bit.
Digress. All right, anybody else want to ask a question? We have time for one more question.
I might raise my hand. But...
Okay, go ahead, Dean. I'll ask it for you. Dean's the videographer. He's going to ask a question.
All right.
Okay.
So, how do I put this? Is there any possible way to stop what's the global warming that's been going on?
Is there any possible way to stop the global warming that we've caused?
Well, I happen to be somebody who is an inveterate optimist, and I have to think that it is. The key is those greenhouse gases, and those greenhouse gases are emitted when we use energy that is generated from burning coal, oil, and natural gas. So what we have to do collectively, individually, is make a commitment to reducing our use of fossil fuel energy. The key to that is transferring as much as we possibly can to renewable energy sources, solar, wind, geothermal, those kinds of sources using those kinds of resources which do not involve burning fossil fuel. So the evidence suggests we do have the chance to slow down this global warming, but we really, really have to act very, very quickly. We don't have decades to do this. I think that the guesstimates are we better have this whole thing taken care of within 10 to 15 years, otherwise we are really in serious danger of crossing tipping points where a whole series of reactions, positive feedback loops start taking over, and the whole problem becomes unsolvable. So yes, I think we have a chance, but we have to operate on that principle, because if we throw our hands up in despair and say it's too late, inevitably it is, because if we say it's too late, then we stop doing anything to try and solve it, and it becomes too late even if it wasn't when we said it.
All right, well, thank you so much for your time, Alan. Let's give a round of applause.
You're more than welcome.
All right, and we'll talk to you later, because my next period will be wanting to Skype with you in, maybe a month or something. All right.
Okay, let's do it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.